1922 Germany. A farmhouse stands alone among the trees, far from any road and even farther from help. Over the course of 6 days, 6 people vanished from the world without a single cry heard or a single soul seen fleeing the scene. Only smoke curled from the chimney, and the cows remained milked, fed, and calm inside the barn. A presence lived there, not hiding, but staying among the dead. Welcome to Sanctified Secrets, the place where the coldest crimes are never truly buried. Subscribe now before the silence swallows this one too. Most people can't hear stories like these. They scroll past, they turn away. But if you're still here, maybe you're one of the few brave enough to come this far. Andreas Gruber was a cruel man by most accounts. He ruled his family with a hard voice and a heavy hand, isolating them inside the farmhouse known only as Hinterkaifeck. He lived there with his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children Joseph and young Cecilia, and a maid who had just arrived on the day everything ended. The house stood quiet for days before the first body fell. Strange footprints had been seen in the snow leading toward the house, but none ever led back away. Doors were found unlocked. An attic creaked with footsteps the family did not take. The key to the tool shed vanished. The dog barked at shadows that no one else saw, and still, they stayed. Inside the home, something was already waiting. It began not with a scream, but a subtle sound so small it might have been mistaken for wind. A scuffle in hay, a door creaking half an inch more open than it should have been. Victoria stepped outside first, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, breath fogging in the freezing air, drawn to a noise in the barn or perhaps a presence she felt more than heard. She crossed the icy yard, her boots leaving shallow impressions in snow crusted over from the weight of March frost. Her father Andreas followed, muttering under his breath, irritated as always, his face twisted in suspicion. Then came his wife Cecilia, reluctant, perhaps afraid, but unwilling to stay behind alone. And finally little Cecilia, only 7, too young to understand but old enough to obey. 4 souls moved one by one toward the barn, and not a single one returned. Inside that barn, something waited in the dark between the tools and the hay, something holding a mattock, a curved blade designed for farm work, now gripped not for labor but for slaughter. The killer struck with cruel rhythm, not hurried, not frenzied, but slow, methodical, deliberate. Andreas's skull shattered on the first blow, his body crumpling into straw without a cry. His wife fell next, eyes wide open, mouth still forming his name. Victoria may have fought back. There were signs, torn fabric, broken fingers, blood sprayed at strange angles, but she lost all the same. Her daughter, little Cecilia, was the last in that barn. Her face was torn, her jaw broken. They said she lived for hours afterward in that dark barn alone, her hands full of her own hair, yanked out in pain and terror before death came fully for her. But the horror was not finished. Inside the house, 2 still remained. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, who had only arrived that afternoon with a suitcase and a fresh apron. She had barely unpacked, barely breathed the cold farmhouse air before a shadow crossed her threshold and ended her story in a single crushing strike. And baby Joseph, still in his cot, cheeks pink from sleep, eyes fluttering beneath the dim lamplight, never even stirred when the killer came. His skull was broken in his crib, his final breath lost without a sound. And then, the killer stayed. The house did not fall silent after the murders. It came alive in the most terrible way possible. Fires were stoked in the hearth. The chimney continued to breathe its curling gray smoke into the winter sky. The animals were fed and milked on schedule. The dog barked once, but not again. Someone moved through the house as if they belonged there, as if they had always belonged there. The killer did not leave. They stayed. They swept the floor. They cooked meals from the family's pantry. They lit lanterns in rooms where the dead still lay cold. They slept in the beds warmed by the same blood they had spilled. They walked in boots that were not theirs and looked through windows that had never welcomed their eyes outside. Some said neighbors noticed shadows at night, movement behind curtains, soft flickers of oil light in upstairs rooms, but no one dared knock on the door. Not yet. No one was reported missing just yet. Life on a distant farm often grew quiet this time of year. The townspeople told themselves the Grubers were resting. The children were ill. The mail had simply been forgotten. But the days stretched on. The smoke continued to rise. The livestock made noise, but no one answered it. The trail of footprints leading into the house remained frozen in the snow. No others appeared. No carriage came. No visitor left. A murder had happened, but the world hadn't noticed because the house pretended to still be alive. It wasn't until the fourth day that the quiet began to feel wrong. Neighbors noticed young Casilia was missing from school. Her teacher sent word, but no reply came. The postman remarked that the mail had gone untouched for days. The grocer wondered why no one had come for bread. A mechanic had been scheduled to visit the farm to repair a piece of equipment, but arrived to find the gate shut and no one answering his calls. Yet the smoke still drifted from the chimney as if all were well. The animals had not starved. The cows had been milked. The dog had been tied up outside and then moved again. Someone was there, but no one answered. On April 4th, 4 days after the last confirmed sighting of the Gruber family, a group of concerned neighbors decided to enter the property themselves. They walked the same snowy path the killer had used, but unlike the footprints that once led in theirs, would also mark a path back out. They approached the barn first, calling out to Andreas, then to Victoria, but nothing stirred. The doors creaked as they opened and the smell hit them before their eyes could understand what they were seeing. Inside the barn, under a layer of hay, were the bodies. Andreas first, then his wife, then Victoria, and then little Casilia. Their skulls had been crushed, their blood long dried. The hay was dark with rot and soaked into the wooden floor. The silence was heavy and choking. There was no question what had happened here, but there was no clue as to who had done it. The men did not speak as they stepped out of the barn into the bitter daylight. The wind scraped across the snow, but nothing could clear the weight of what they had seen. Andreas, Casilia, Victoria, and little Casilia lay broken beneath the hay, and yet there were still 2 missing. Maria, the maid, and baby Joseph were not in the barn. One of the men moved slowly toward the house, each step cautious, as if the killer might still be waiting behind the door. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick with a smell that did not belong to the living. The first room was cold, the second colder, and in the maid's chamber, they found her. Maria Baumgartner was laid out beside her bed as if she had been trying to run or rise or pray before she died. Her face had been struck cleanly, her features barely visible under the congealed blood. Her suitcase sat beside her unopened, a coat still folded across a chair untouched. She had only just arrived that same day to begin her new job. She had not even lived there for 24 hours before her name was written into the floorboards in blood. And then came the smallest room, the nursery. The cradle sat quiet, a small blanket still neatly tucked into its corner. But beneath it, baby Joseph's skull had been split in a single blow. His body was limp, his lips parted as if caught mid-sigh. Every member of the household had been murdered in the space of a single night. There was no sign of forced entry. No doors were broken, no valuables stolen, nothing disturbed except their lives. Everything inside the house had been left in place except for them. The news spread faster than the wind ever could, and by the next morning the farmhouse was surrounded not just by neighbors, but by officers summoned from Munich, a team unprepared for what they were about to find. The crime scene was like nothing they had encountered. The killer had not just ended lives, he had occupied them, lived inside them, slept in their beds, stoked their fires, milked their cows, fed their dog. The chimney had smoked for days after the murders, proving someone had remained within those walls long after death had taken everyone else. The bodies in the barn were partially covered in hay, suggesting not panic, but intention. An effort to hide yet also preserve. Not one body had been moved far. No attempt had been made to destroy evidence. Even the murder weapon, a heavy mattock typically used for digging, had been left behind. The killer had not run. He had not feared discovery. He had walked through each room with full ownership, as if the farm had always belonged to him. The investigators searched every wallboard, every beam, every drawer, and found nothing missing. Every bit of cash still sat in drawers. Jewelry untouched. Food half prepared in the kitchen. Firewood stacked neatly beside the stove. One officer noted that the killer had eaten meals using the family's own utensils as if nothing had happened. His footprints were still visible in the snow, days later leading in from the forest and stopping at the door. Not a single print led back out. Whoever had come into Hinterkaifeck had stayed, and had vanished like smoke up the chimney, leaving only blood behind. As the investigators tried to piece together the horror inside Hinterkaifeck, a darker truth settled like fog over the village. The killer was not a stranger, at least, not to the land. No horse had been heard, no carriage seen, no footsteps in the snow led away from the scene. The one trail of boots that entered the property remained the only evidence of movement, and that trail had come from the forest, a place locals rarely wandered, even in daylight. Eyes began to turn toward the nearby fields and farms, to the people who had always been there. One name surfaced again and again: Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was a neighbor, a farmer, a widower, a man with a quiet way and a buried connection to the victims. He had once been involved with Victoria Gruber's daughter. Some whispered that her youngest child, Joseph, was not her husband's child but Lorenz's. When the bodies were found, it was Lorenz who had unlocked the house. It was Lorenz who had known which doors to try, which rooms to enter. It was Lorenz who had stepped calmly over blood and hay without hesitation, as if he already knew what he would find. When questioned, he gave answers, but his tone was flat and strange. He said he had entered the house to look for survivors, but there were no cries, no effort to move the bodies, no sign of shock. Even stranger Lorenz returned to the farm days later alone, walking through the property, checking the rooms like a man revisiting a memory. Some claimed he even moved into the house for a time to tend the land, as if the murders had left no stain behind, but no charges were ever filed. There was no proof, only suspicions, only rumors, only a trail of blood leading into silence. The bodies were removed from the barn, and the house laid out under gray skies for autopsy, their cold limbs stiff, their wounds carved deep into bone. A village doctor, assisted by police, began the work of examining what was left of the Gruber family. Each skull had been shattered by powerful blunt force trauma. The killer had used the mattock with such force that in some cases, pieces of bone were embedded into the walls and beams surrounding the bodies. Andreas Gruber's face was nearly unrecognizable. His skull split open, his cheek torn away, exposing teeth beneath eyes that were swollen shut. Kazelia, the elder, had deep head wounds and signs of strangulation, as if the killer had taken no chances, ensuring death twice over. Victoria's injuries were more violent than most. Her skull broke in her face, beaten, her neck bruised as though she had resisted more than the others. But it was the youngest victim, little Cecilia, who haunted the investigators most. Her body told a different story. Her wounds were severe but incomplete. Her face torn, her jaw shattered. But the horror was in her hands. They were clutching tufts of her own hair torn from her scalp, suggesting she had not died instantly. She had lived for hours, perhaps an entire night, crawling among the bodies in the barn, in pain, alone in the dark, waiting for someone who never came. The maid Maria had died quickly, her skull crushed while she likely knelt beside her bed. The baby Joseph was struck while lying in his cot. No sign of movement, no sign of defense. The killer had not rushed. He had taken his time, each blow deliberate, each death certain except for one, except for the little girl who died slowly, unseen beneath the hay. As days turned into weeks and answers refused to come, the investigators began to reach beyond reason, grasping at anything that might offer direction. The farmhouse had become a symbol of something darker than murder, a place where logic failed and dread remained unshaken. Locals refused to go near it after nightfall. Some claimed they still heard footsteps in the attic or saw flickering light through boarded windows. even though the property was sealed. Some whispered that the land was cursed, that the forest had claimed the family in a hunger older than the village itself. With no suspects, no motive, and no escape route, the police turned to superstition. The skulls of all 6 victims were removed from their bodies and sent to Munich in hope that clairvoyance might uncover truths. The living could not. The heads were studied, touched, held in candlelight by mediums who claimed to see shadows of the final moments. They said Victoria cried for her daughter. They said the maid felt the blow before she heard the sound. They said Andreas was already afraid before he entered the barn. But nothing conclusive came from these rituals. No names whispered, no faces seen, just vague impressions, echoes, grief. All 6 skulls were kept in Munich and never returned, their bodies buried headless beneath plain markers in Weidhofen, the cemetery cold and anonymous. Their silence continued even in death. Their voices had been erased. Their home remained untouched, unclaimed, a place left to rot, while the village around it tried to forget what still stood between the trees, but forgetting proved impossible. Not when the house still stood, not when the killer had never been found. Years passed, but Hinterkaifeck did not fade. The barn stood like a monument to what had been done, its beams soaked with silence, its roof groaning beneath every winter that followed. The farmhouse began to rot, its windows dark, its doors creaking open in the wind as if still waiting for someone to return. But no one ever did. No family moved in, no animals returned, no child laughed in its halls again. It became a wound on the land, a place spoken of only in whispers, children warned not to wander near. Even the path leading to it began to vanish as weeds and roots pulled the earth back into itself in 1923. 1 year after the murders, the farmhouse was torn down by men hired from a nearby town. They came with axes and shovels, their faces pale, their movements stiff as they took apart the building, one rotten plank at a time. Some said they heard knocking from the floorboards. Some refused to enter the upper rooms where the light always seemed to flicker. One worker claimed to have seen a shadow dart past him in the stairwell only to find the room empty. The house came down slowly, unwillingly, as if resisting its own destruction, and as the final wall collapsed, something was found buried beneath the floor, a hidden compartment carved into the foundation inside it, the blood-stained mattock. The weapon no one had seen since the first day, now rusted but unmistakable. It had been hidden, not discarded. The killer had not taken it. He had left it behind as if mocking the investigators, daring them to understand what had been done. But they never would. The farmhouse was gone, but its story remained rooted in the ground beneath it. Even with the house gone, Hinterkaifeck refused to be forgotten. The murders haunted Germany like a specter that would not rest. And though years passed, the case remained open, unofficially reopened again and again as new officers took interest. New witnesses stepped forward and old suspicions resurfaced. Everyone had a theory. Some believed it had been Lorenz Schlittenbauer acting out of jealousy or rage, silencing a child he believed was his born from a woman he could not claim. Others thought it was a drifter, a madman passing through the woods who stumbled upon the farm and found it too quiet, too easy, too filled with lives to end. But the precision of the murders, the knowledge of the layout, the decision to stay and tend the animals and live among the dead, these were not the actions of a stranger. The killer had known the Gruber family had moved through their world without error, had touched their objects, sat in their chairs, walked through their rooms as if he had done it many times before. A relative, a farmhand, a neighbor, no one could say for certain. In later years, new suspects emerged, men with criminal records, men who confessed in drunken stupors, but none of them knew enough. None of them could explain the missing keys, the attic noises, the footprints, the silence that followed. Each strike, time blurred memory, and memory blurred. Truth witnesses grew old. Records faded. Some files were lost during the war. Others were buried beneath bureaucracy. But the question never changed. Who came to Hinterkaifeck? Who waited in the attic? Who killed 6 people and stayed behind as if they had never left? Long after the bodies were buried and the farmhouse reduced to rubble, The name Hinterkaifeck took on a second life, not as a location, but as a warning. It became something parents muttered to restless children when they refused to sleep, a ghost story. Dressed in truth, a place that had existed but was now more shadow than soil. Children dared each other to wander near the field where the house once stood, but none stayed past sunset. They said the ground still smelled like iron. They said the snow never settled right where the barn had been. The trees around it grew in strange, twisted directions, as if recoiling from something beneath the surface. In taverns and kitchens, stories were told, not just of the murders, but of the evil that came before them. Some claimed Andreas Gruber had dabbled in the occult. Others believed the forest itself had birthed something hungry that chose the farmhouse as its cradle. There were those who swore they had seen lights in the trees. Cold blue flickers that hovered then vanished when approached footsteps were still heard in the attic. Though there was no longer an attic to hear them, the legacy of Hinterkaifeck was no longer rooted in police reports or coroner notes, but in dreams and warnings, in the quiet hush that fell whenever the name was spoken aloud. Some names are etched into marble and remembered for greatness. Others, like Hinterkaifeck, are whispered only when the fire has gone out and the night is too long and the woods are too close, and the snow begins to fall without a sound. Decades passed, and still the silence of Hinterkaifeck was louder than answers. It drew not just fear but fascination. Historians, crime writers, even amateur sleuths began digging through yellowed police files and crumbling witness statements, chasing a ghost that refused to take form. In the age of technology, new eyes fell upon the case. Satellite images, archive scans, DNA speculation, but nothing could pierce the black veil that still hung over that farm in the woods. Too much had been lost. The skulls sent to Munich had vanished during the Second World War. Some said they were bombed. Others claimed they were stolen, burned, or buried. But without them, the most direct evidence of the killer's hand was gone. The original crime scene had been destroyed, dismantled, erased. Only photographs remained, grainy, black and white images of broken bodies beneath hay and blood-soaked beams. Modern detectives examined the angle of each blow, the arrangement of the corpses, the position of the furniture, but all it revealed was what had always been known. The killer had been calm, precise, and confident. He had not feared being caught. He had stayed long enough to warm his hands by the fire and feed the cows one last time. He had left no note, no message, no mark except for the emptiness he carved into the land where the farmhouse once stood. And still people searched, some out of curiosity, some out of obsession. But none ever truly got closer than the ones who had first stood in that barn with hay clinging to their boots and horror climbing their throats. What they found then is all we still have. Now blood prints, a silence that fed itself. The dead were buried, but those left behind carried the weight of Hinterkaifeck in ways no grave could contain. Relatives of the Gruber family lived on, scattered across towns and villages, some bearing the shame of suspicion. Others the hollow ache of unanswered grief. No funeral brought closure. No priest's words could smooth the horror of what had been done in that house. Those who knew Andreas called him cruel, but still he was kin. Victoria had been mourned by some, judged by others, her relationship with Lorenz a whisper in every room she'd once entered. Maria Baumgartner's sister never spoke publicly again. Her only words were offered at the burial, and then she vanished into solitude, saying she still heard footsteps at night, as if her sister was trying to come home but couldn't find the way. Even years later, family members refused to speak the name Hinterkaifeck aloud, afraid that doing so would summon something back into the light. A cousin who had visited the farm just months before the murders claimed he saw a man near the edge of the forest, staring at the house, standing too still for too long. He thought it was a scarecrow until it moved, but he never told anyone until it was too late. After the burial, the 6 bodies lay in a single row at Weidhofen, headless beneath the soil, marked only by weathered crosses, with names carved shallow, as if even stone dared not speak too loudly. Their skulls lost to history, their voices lost to silence, their memories kept alive only by the questions they left behind. The families stopped returning to the graves, the weeds grew high, the names faded, the wound never closed. It only went quiet. As time crawled forward and the fields around Hinterkaifeck grew wild with thorns and wind, there were whispers that the killer had come back, not to kill again but to visit, to walk the same broken ground where he had once stood in darkness and claimed 6 lives. Some said they saw a man dressed in black standing near the old foundation in the early morning fog, just watching, never moving, never speaking. Others said tools left in the weeds went missing and returned days later, cleaned and rearranged as if someone were tending to a memory that never faded. Even decades after the murders, hunters passing through the woods spoke of strange shapes moving through the trees. Sounds like footsteps pacing over frozen leaves, and once the faint sound of a lullaby heard near the clearing where the barn had once stood. No one was there when they looked. Only silence. Only trees. Only a chill that settled beneath the skin and would not lift for hours. Some believe the killer had never left at all, that he had found something in that house, some stillness, some darkness he could not let go of, that he returned again and again to relive what he had done, not with guilt, but with reverence, as though Hinterkaifeck was not a crime scene but a shrine. The animals had been cared for, the house had been kept warm, the killer had shown devotion, not just violence, and in that devotion was something older than rage. It was a possession, an obsession, a tether to the place where he had become something more than a man, something that even now might still walk those woods when the snow falls and the world forgets to watch. As the memory of Hinterkaifeck grew older, its shadow began to stretch beyond the clearing where the farmhouse once stood. Neighbors in surrounding villages whispered of strange happenings, animals found dead without explanation, children going missing in the woods only to return silent, their eyes wide and distant. Their stories didn't make sense. They spoke of a man with no face standing in the fog, of a woman calling from the trees, whose mouth didn't move. Some claimed to have seen flickering lantern light bobbing between the pines in the middle of the night, always in the direction of the old farm, even though nothing remained there but frost and ruin. A man from a nearby town disappeared while hunting. His tracks stopped in the snow near the old property and were never seen again. His rifle was found weeks later, leaned carefully against a tree barrel, cleaned as if waiting to be used again. Some said the earth itself had been marked by the blood that soaked it in 1922, that it had absorbed something that could never be undone. Even those who didn't believe the stories still avoided the area. Children were warned never to follow the river past a certain bend, never to go near the clearing with no birds, no rabbits, no sound at all. Foresters reported strange compass failures near the site, and once a group of hikers turned back after hearing what they thought was hammering deep underground. When they walked past the overgrown edge of the former foundation, something still moved there. Even without walls or roof, the shape of the house remained in the land like a bruise beneath skin, and it was still watching. The world beyond Bavaria eventually heard the name Hinterkaifeck. It slipped into books, documentaries, lectures, whispered interviews, and podcasts, its stories stretched and twisted, repackaged for audiences who would never walk the woods or feel the weight of the silence, their writers called it. Germany's most mysterious unsolved crime film crews stood where the house had once loomed, setting their cameras where blood had once pooled, reenacting moments that no one had survived to describe. They told it as a ghost story, as a mystery, as a cautionary tale, but none of them ever captured the thing that mattered most: the quiet, the way the wind stopped near the foundation, the way animals refused to graze there still, the way the air itself grew colder when you stepped too close to where the barn had stood. It was not a legend. It was a wound, and no amount of retelling could make it safe. People wrote their theories, traced maps, compared timelines, debated whether the killer had been Lorenz or a stranger, or someone who had lived in the attic the whole time. But the soil didn't care. The bones didn't care. The truth remained somewhere deeper, older, darker than any archive could reach. It lived in the stillness between trees in the cold where no birds sang, in the faint outline of a path that no one had walked in decades, but somehow never disappeared. The farmhouse was gone, but the story had roots, and roots remember. Among all the theories that swirled like ash around the name Hinterkaifeck, one surfaced only in hushed corners of forums and late-night conversations, a theory not often printed in books, but passed like a secret from those who had stood too close for too long. It whispered that the killer had not been a man, or if he had been, he had not been alone. That something else had guided him, or walked beside him unseen and ancient. The precision of the murders, the silence, the calm, the fact that he stayed without fear, without need for escape, suggested a mind no longer tethered to reason. Some believed the forest had chosen him, that something old and hungry had watched the family for months and found in him a willing vessel, an opening, a door. Others believed the footsteps in the attic had not all been his, that there were more than one set of boots pacing while the family slept. They spoke of the attic being more than a hiding place, but a nest, a womb for something that had waited, and when it acted, it did so, not with chaos, but with purpose. 6 deaths, all aligned in time and space, all tied by routine. The animals fed, the fires lit, the rituals kept. The killer had not destroyed the home. He had preserved it, maintained it, as if paying tribute to something he could not name, something that required offerings. And when the task was complete, he did not flee because he did not need to. He was done, the thing was fed, and he had served. Whatever had walked through the snow that night may have worn boots and breathed air, but it was not alone in that barn, not in that house, not in that silence. Years after the farmhouse had vanished and the ground where it stood had been swallowed by grass and silence, something happened that no one could explain. A caretaker at the Weidhofen cemetery arrived early one morning to find that the graves of the 6 Hinterkaifeck victims had been disturbed. Not dug up, not vandalized, but altered. Each of the simple wooden crosses had been carefully cleaned. The weeds around them trimmed back, the stones realigned with unnatural precision. It looked less like maintenance and more like reverence, a gesture not of guilt, but of ownership, as if someone had returned to see their work, not mourn it. No one had requested the service. No family had come in decades, but near baby Joseph's grave something had been left, half buried beneath the dirt, and moss was a small carved figure, its face crude and mouthless, its eyes wide and hollow, made of bone or wood, or something that had aged too slowly to name. It didn't match any local tradition. It didn't belong to any known symbol, but it was there, small, cold, deliberate. A note was never found. No prints, no trail, just the doll, just the cleaned graves, just the message that someone had been there, someone who remembered, someone who returned, perhaps not every year, perhaps not every decade, but enough to prove that the story was not finished, that somewhere out there in the long, quiet spaces between villages and trees, a shadow still carried the memory of Hinterkaifeck, not as guilt, not as fear, but as something sacred, and it had not forgotten where the bodies were buried. There is no ending to Hinterkaifeck, not really, only a point where the story grows too quiet to hear, and the snow covers what was left behind. The farmhouse is gone. The barn is gone. The blood has long since soaked into earth that no longer remembers names, but the silence remains. Not just the silence of death, but the kind that hums beneath your skin when you walk alone and know something unseen is watching. This is the silence that lived in the attic before the murders. The silence that sat beside the fire after the last breath was drawn. The silence that waited behind the barn doors as Victoria stepped through first and never returned. It is the silence that speaks when stories fail, that breathes when evidence decays, that lingers not in books or files or interviews, but in the bones of the place itself. Hinterkaifeck was never solved because it was never meant to be. It wasn't a riddle. It was a warning, a moment carved into time where something ancient reached through one man or more and showed how thin the wall truly is between the world we know and the one that watches from the woods. The killer was never found because he had already become part of the story. And stories don't bleed. They whisper. They drift. They settle in places we forget to look and wait, for footsteps, for firelight, for a house too quiet, a window half open, a child's voice in a place where no children remain, and when it comes again, as it always does, it won't wear a name. It will wear the silence of Hinterkaifeck, and it will already be inside.